I'm delighted to welcome to the first Tech Trailblazers Judges on Fire podcast of 2021, Jessica Lee. And Jessica has a number of roles, and we came across one another when you were with Soma Capital, but you've also been very heavily involved as head of content for Elpha as well. So welcome, Jessica. Great to see you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
No problem. So perhaps you'd like to give us initially, not everybody who's listening will have had the opportunity to meet you or know you. So perhaps you could give a little bit of an overview of, your startup journey and your involvement in the startup community and the tech community.
Yes, of course. So a little bit more on myself. I'm currently full-time with a company called Zegina, which is basically a B2B procurement marketplace in the life sciences, sort of like an Amazon for the life sciences, where biotech startups, pharma companies, labs, researchers, et cetera, can go to more easily and more seamlessly procure all their lab equipment, materials, and supplies all in one place. And so doing growth marketing here, our growth marketing team is just 3 people, 2 when I joined, or 2 including myself when I joined. So even though the company is a little bit larger, a growth stage startup based in Boston and Berlin, our growth team is relatively small. And so that's what I do full time. And then part time, as you alluded to, I had content for Elpha, which is a community of women in tech. We now have a little over 40,000 members worldwide, which is super exciting. So I manage all of our featured posts published twice a week, and then also our asynchronous twice a week office hours, Ask Me Anythings, as we call them, with really incredible women on or off the platform. So those are my 2 main roles, but then I also do some other content things, including heading content with Harvard and Tech and Techstars Boston, and also writing for Pinduoduo, which is this e-commerce company in China. And then previously was in the investing world, as you alluded to, was working at Soma Capital prior to Zegina, which is a seed stage fund, which is a sector agnostic fund focused on enterprise. Joined them as their first full-time hire, which was super exciting. So did everything from sourcing to diligence to content to community and portfolio operations and some investor relations as well. And they're based in San Francisco, and headed content with Elpha there as well, part-time still. And then these days, to stay connected to the startup world, also mentor with several different accelerators, including Techstars and Alchemist and Acceleprise and Plug and Play. So pretty much pre-seed and seed accelerators across all kinds of spaces and sectors. And more recently, IndieBio as well, which is a biotech specific accelerator, given my new role at Zegina, and then doing some angel investing on the side and scouting for different groups, including Gresham Robotics and Predictive VC. And prior to all of that, and prior to Soma, I spent some time in startup world working with Morning Brew and Locks, also some time in public markets, investing with an endowment, a family office in Northwestern Mutual, and then also some time in investment banking at Morgan Stanley, and then finally some time at other early stage venture funds, including General Catalyst, which is how full circle I came back to be connected with Zegina when General Catalyst led our Series B back in 2019. And so, yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Wow, a busy lady. So thank you very much for making the time to chat. That's brilliant. Well, you joined us as a judge quite late in the day, unfortunately, in 2020. So you've not perhaps had the exposure to the startups that we'd like you to have. And unfortunately, due to a prior commitment, you're not able to join us for the showcase that we've got with some of our winners that's happening on the 25th. But aside from that, it'd be great. Obviously, you have a vast amount of experience, both on both sides of the fence in the startup world, both from an investment perspective, of which you're obviously still involved, and within the startup side of things. So when you're judging, what kind of startups are going to attract your attention? What's going to sort of light your fire around the kind of people who participate in awards?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think for me, especially in the early stage, which I imagine is most relevant for most listeners, in the pre-seed, seed, sometimes even Series A stage, I think what's really important to me is first and foremost the team, because the product and subsequently the market and everything around the more fact-based aspects of the company can change and shift as the company goes through the process of finding product market. Athletic tech companies pivot to fintech, which seems totally different. I've seen as sort of a more famous example, Embark Trucks, which is one of our former portfolio companies at Soma Capital. That's now a very big company. They had a massive growth round, I think in late 2018, if not late 2019, led by Tiger Global, which is obviously a very well-known, very big and very global growth fund. And when they first started back in the seed stage, when they were in Y Combinator, they started off as an autonomous golf cart company, which if you overanalyze that market, it sounds silly or small or just not a big pain point. And if you had been stuck on that, you would have missed out on a really great investment opportunity as an investor or as a judge or supporter of the startup community. And now obviously they haven't yet gone public. They're still a private company, but doing super well by all metrics. And they're doing autonomous trucking, which is of course, sounds like a more reasonable market and a big market, big growing market that they're really dominating. And so I think in this case, really focusing on the founder and really understanding him or her and understanding how they think and how they see the world. Obviously, pedigree and prior experience is a factor, but I don't think it should be an overwhelming factor. I think it's much more about those more qualitative and harder to judge or less black and white aspects of a founder, their perseverance, their resilience. If they've had experiences in the past prior to founding this company where they've had to build and rebuild over and over again. One of my favorite founders who I met through my work at General Catalyst, it was really interesting because he was actually a researcher in his past life prior to founding this fintech company. And one thing that had happened to him is that he was doing this multi-year long bio project. And he was working with Petri dishes. I'm not too sure of the details, but one of his eyelashes dropped into the Petri dish in sort of like the last minute or final mile, final stretch of his project. And I don't think it ruined his whole project. That would have been a little bit drastic. And hopefully he had some backups for it, but it did, throw him for a loop and throw his project out of sync. And just like small things like that, where you have to redo, a 2, 3, 1 year long experiment that you poured a ton of time and a ton of heart and energy into, but not giving up and, actually just sucking it up and persevering and being resilient. It doesn't have to be anything super drastic. Obviously it could be, but it could be something more professional, more academic like that, but just sort of proving your resilience. So looking for attributes like that in founders and also looking for a well-rounded team, especially of founders who've worked together before, because I think a lot of times there is this big difference between people who met each other and can get along over drinks or over dinner or once a week or once a month or whatever, like all of our, typical general friends. But it's a very different experience to actually work together and be collectively accountable for a deliverable together. And I think that's obviously something founders do literally 24/7 or co-founders do 24/7 together. And I think a lot of times people have this misconception where they get along well with someone over, again, drinks, coffee, dinner, et cetera, but it's a whole different experience to work with them. So I'd love to see when founders, obviously not always or not mandatory, but it's always really helpful to see that they have worked together on something in the past. I think finally, it's also really helpful to see founders who are very process oriented and not outcome oriented. Obviously, all of the company will have an amazing outcome at the end, and that's really great, but it probably won't come, if at all, for 7 to 10 years in those earliest stages. And so founders need to be very process oriented and love the ride and do ridiculously challenging things just for fun. I met another founder back when I was at Harvard who's building this sort of like 3D printing farm, which is super cool. And they're still early stage, so hard to say what will happen. But one thing he said that prepared him really well for his founder journey beyond classes, jobs, experiences is just his process of tinkering and working on different projects, because that was this experience of doing something insanely difficult, not for a grade, not for an outcome, not for a pat on the back, even not for money, but really just to enjoy the process and enjoy the process of actually creating something from nothing. And that's obviously what founders do for limited short-term or intermediate, medium-term rewards. And so it's really important to look for people who have that quality and characteristic.
Indeed. And certainly from what you say, I think is true about the team and, multiple co-founders. I certainly found that a lot of our winners have, people who've worked together in the past, who set up companies together. And I think that's one of the very exciting things about enterprise tech is that it's much, much easier because it just tends to be, you tend to see with enterprise tech that you are repeat offenders, if that's a right word, that people can replicate it because they understand it. They've got the access to the contacts from a financial perspective and from a commercial perspective, and they kind of have the blueprint for success of what they need to put in place and the processes as well as the people. So I think obviously you've talked a little bit about Elpha as a female focus. And obviously that's one of the things that particularly sort of drew us together. Obviously Tech Trailblazers is founded by a female. We have our Female Tech Trailblazers Award, which focuses on ladies as well as the male. What are you seeing within, the feedback within Elpha around what's happening? It's been a very challenging, as everybody likes to sort of point out, time. And how are female founders and female senior execs in startups? What's the sort of the mood, the feeling out there at the moment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, as you alluded to, it's been a very challenging time, obviously, for everyone with COVID and all that's going on in the world right now, in the US, abroad as well. And obviously, as a lot of the data has recently shown, there was a report from Q4 2020. And then obviously earlier this year in the US, at least with our jobs report, in the report in Q4, which was more on funding, it showed that there was a significant decrease in funding to female founders or female-led companies, even relative to investment in male firms. Then earlier this month, with the latest jobs report in the US, it showed that women lost many more jobs in the prior quarter than men, many more, which is obviously very disappointing. And there's all this research and hypothecating that's showing that a lot of times women leave the workforce, not because they can't find a job, perhaps. I mean, some of it is due to that, but also they voluntarily leave the workforce. So they're not even counted in that unemployment rate or job loss rate because they are voluntarily withdrawing, but because they need to take care of housework and children and education as schools remain closed, or parents just don't feel comfortable, understandably, putting their children back into schools, given the COVID situation is still not great, to say the least, in the US or other countries as well. And so lots of concerning data on that front, in addition to all of the macro events that are affecting everybody. And so in terms of Elpha and just sort of more anecdotally, what I've seen elsewhere, I think there's definitely been a lot more vulnerability, which I think is really great, because I think the worst thing, or one of the worst things you can do, is sort of keep it all inside of you and feel like you're the only one feeling this way, or that you're unusual, or something is wrong with you, or kind of just bottling it all up, especially when it comes to something that is more emotional and less kind of black and white or less fact-based. And it's very understandable and very normal to feel negative emotions with all this going on, especially in the women's community more broadly. And so it's been really great to see more people on Elpha. We have this feature where once you're logged in, you can post anonymously. So it's a cool kind of blend where you have to be logged in. So not just any random, troll, robot, whatever on the internet can post, as you sometimes see on Reddit or other kind of not great anonymous forums. So it's nice because you do have to log in and be an actual member of the community, and we let people in not on like a titles or seniority basis, but more on an intentions base of making sure, regardless of your age or background, but that you're really positively intentioned. And so I think that's really nice to have a diversity of people in every sense of the word, who all have really positive, really good, very collaborative and supportive intentions. And so once you're logged in, you can post anonymously. And so it's nice because people feel like they can be more vulnerable and be more open, especially when it is a more sensitive topic. I recently saw a post where someone said that they've been crying a lot all the time, and it was posted on anonymous, understandably, but that's sort of something that you don't always talk about, in the typical work meeting or on the typical LinkedIn or Twitter post. But I imagine it's something that a lot of us are going through, or kind of similar emotions, even if not, literally crying. And similarly, somebody had posted about this long-term relationship that they were kind of rethinking due to some events that happened during COVID between this person and her partner. And so different things like that, where people are being more vulnerable and being more open and setting an example for others that this is okay, and normalizing this behavior and this sense of feeling sad or lonely or kind of other negative emotions, but then also kind of having different community members, many of them not anonymous, so you can message them directly if you want to have further conversations, and many of them anonymous as well if they want to sort of share their own experiences that have been similar. But basically, regardless, different community members responding with their advice and their empathy, and just sort of a very supportive community. There's never been a negative comment where someone's, calling somebody out for feeling vulnerable or, other kind of understandable behaviors. Everybody's just super understanding and super supportive. And so I think the downside obviously is everything awful that's going on, both for everybody and also for women in particular. But I think the silver lining, if you will, is that people are more open to being vulnerable. And then in turn, people are more open to feeling what they're feeling, as well as supporting others and being able to support others. I think a lot of times if you don't share how you're feeling, it's harder for others to obviously know and to be able to provide that support. And so I think the sort of positive feedback cycle is really good to have gotten started in a more meaningful way during these challenging times.
Yeah, it sounds like that type of anonymous being open. And how did you know that was my post? No, I wouldn't say I've been crying any more than usual, but I think we've all had our moments. COVID has certainly tested us all. We're spending a lot more time on our own or on virtual conferences. We're not getting a lot of the support. And I think that's particularly true for everybody, and I think it's great that there is a forum for women to have that. But it does sound like there should, if there isn't already, something for everybody, really, to have that ability to be able to say, hey, this is not okay for me at the moment. And, I'd like some support. So, so that's great. And I'm glad that people are finding that there in a huge community of 40,000 ladies. So that's brilliant. So, from your perspective of your experience and, two elements, really. One is, what would you say is the biggest lesson that you've learned as someone involved in a startup? And then perhaps the biggest lesson that you've learned or seen when you've looked at it from an investment perspective. So to kick off with, what would you say is your biggest lesson that perhaps you'd like to share, apart from obviously make sure you've got some tissues handy?
Exactly. So in terms of, to the first part of your question of being a part of a startup, I think so many things, and obviously my own learnings and own perspective is from somebody who came from the venture world. So I imagine the learnings would be a little bit, if not a lot, different for somebody who's been involved in big tech or startup land, or maybe some different type of investing, public markets, private equity. But for me, from that perspective, with that context given, a couple of different things, actually. So one thing is sort of, I think when I was in VC, all of my KPIs that I was being judged on and being tracked on were very output oriented. They were obviously, involved a lot of hard work. They were very important work. I loved doing it, but it was very much things that were almost 100% in my control. It was things like, how many founders am I reaching out to? How many founders am I talking to? Which again is important and hard work, but I just, email and I just show up to those calls. It's not inconceivable how I, go about doing that. And it is very much this linear relationship between time and output. You send one email every, 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And that's sort of, how much time you just put in to send n number of emails. But I think in the operator world, what's been really interesting is that, obviously it's still important to be responsive, just Slack messages and emails. But what really matters is the outcomes and not so much the output. I could send a million emails, and if none of them convert to leads, nobody really cares. But if I send, 4 emails, and not literally emails, but just for the sake of analogy, and 2 of them respond positively and become marketing qualified leads, or just otherwise are able to move down our sales funnel, that's much more valuable. And so the sort of decoupling between time and output, and this aspect of working not just hard, but also working smart, and also being creative when we encounter challenges or pushback or, other obstacles. And so basically this kind of 80-20 rule in some ways, where you spend a lot of time sharpening the knife to be able to have these compounding effects that you can reap later on, and not thinking that, oh, this didn't immediately produce output, so it's no good, but kind of being more quality over quantity in different approaches and being more strategic and more thoughtful. And so that's one thing. The second thing is that I think with venture, my relationship building style was very much long-term and broad, obviously, because investors, as many listeners may know, spend most of their days taking external calls with founders, new ones or ones in the portfolio, other investors, et cetera, partners, which is great. And it's great to meet so many people in the ecosystem and build so many long-term relationships, but you're not talking to the same people every single day. And when you are talking to them, once every few months, if not once total or once a year, you're very much just in this position of sharing information. What deal flow are you seeing? What macro trends are you excited about? Which is a super cool conversation, of course, but it's very different from talking to the same, 3 to 5 people every single day and being collectively accountable for a deliverable together. And so that's been very much my, obviously, work day in the operator world. Very few, if any, external calls day to day, and very much, catch-up calls, touch bases, meetings with the same, 3 to 5 people I work most closely with. So very interpersonal, but in a very different way, has been really interesting. It involves a lot more empathy as well, because I think when you're just talking to someone and sharing information, it's, still requires some empathy. You need to know what they're curious about, but it's a little bit more direct. Whereas when you're working cross-functionally, you need to, more implicitly and look at the nonverbal cues of what people care about, what their instincts are, what their work styles are, what their priorities are, what their OKRs or KPIs are for their department or for themselves individually. And so that kind of process of building deeper empathy and working with people more closely over time has been really interesting to learn too, and certainly a skill set that's really invaluable. And so I'm really glad I've been able to build upon it in the operator world. And so that's kind of on the being a part of the startup situation. On the other side of your question, other part, in terms of having invested in previously and a little bit still now as a scout and angel, as an investor, and what I've learned about startups or just learned in general in that world, I think a couple of different things as well. So one, I think what's been really interesting is going to that point of that long-term relationship building. Obviously, this is a little bit less relevant if these are folks you're seeing every single day and working cross-functionally with, but more those people who are important nodes of your network and meaningful relationships with people you don't need to or get to interact with on a daily basis or even weekly or monthly basis. And I think what's really helpful is basically having a give first attitude there. I think a lot of times young people, early career people, even founders, in many cases, they might feel like they're not in a position to give because, for the young people, because they're young, they don't have as much experience. Or if you're a student, even, you feel like you obviously are super young, so you really don't have any experience. And that's sort of how I felt really early on in my career and when I was a student as well. And it was always very much like reaching out to people to ask them for a favor in the form of their time or their advice or their introductions. And obviously, it's great to be able to receive that from people. And of course, some people are able to give more than others, and that is somewhat tied to your age or your career status. But I think always having a give first mentality is something that I've learned a lot through the investing world, because relationship building is just so core to the deal flow you get, to the way in which you're able to win allocation into deals, to the way in which you're able to support founders after you invest as well. And so I think basically, even when you're cold outreaching to people, not just saying like, could I please have, 30 minutes, 20 minutes of your time? I have these questions, but talking about ways in which you can help them as well. And even if you're a university student, for example, and you can't think of, major ways to help, let's say you're reaching out to the CEO of a company or an investor, but you actually you can offer access to the university networks. I know many startups are dying to hire seniors at universities, especially engineers in the early stages, or maybe there's different startups on campus that you're able to refer to investors, for example, what you're reaching out to, who you're reaching out to as an investor, and you're able to offer access to that university startup. So different things like that, or even if none of the above, but you can offer product feedback or organize a focus group if their product is something that you use or a lot of people who use or would benefit from. And so basically being creative around ways in which to give. So I think that's sort of the first thing that I really learned. And I think the second thing is really, I think a lot of times people in the venture world, or people, early on in the venture world, they sort of have this misconception that you need to focus a ton on, tangible things like revenue or pedigree or prior experience and these sort of things that you can quote unquote touch and feel. And it's a sort of concrete fact, if you will. They went to X school, they worked at X company. And obviously those things are not to be dismissed. And there's certainly data points that you should incorporate and be aware of. But I think what's actually much more important is going back to some of what I said earlier, is very much those more intangible or kind of harder to figure out. It's not something you can just look up on LinkedIn and know yes or no, did they go to this school right away? But it's something that you have to work for through getting to know these founders as people and how they see the world and how they problem solve. And a lot of it comes with observation over time. And so I think the most important factor for a founder is perseverance, which is something you can't always quickly fact check on the internet in a moment's time, but something that you have to work hard to understand is really interesting. But I think it also makes for much more interesting investment discussions and much more informed investment decision making, and also stronger relationships that you get to build with founders, regardless of if you invest in them or not.
Okay, wonderful. Well, there's a lot of advice there. A lot of advice. Obviously, 2021 will be kicking off with entries on June 25th, so that's one for the diaries, and then obviously putting it out to yourselves. As I said, it is a shame you can't join us for the meetup next week on the 25th, because we actually have our Tech Trailblazers female winner, Stephanie Fohn from New Vector, joining us for that, and a couple of the other judges as well as some of the other winners. But it's certainly something that we'd like to do in the future. I'm trying to think is there anything else that you'd like to share with listeners? Any other sort of pointers or insights that you feel would be, this would be a good vehicle to share on?
Yeah, I think one kind of final thing I'll add that I think I've learned throughout the year, sometimes perhaps the hard way, but one thing that's really stuck with me is I think a lot of times people have a misconception around what they should or what they need to do. I think so. I went to Harvard, and obviously I'm really glad and, super grateful for that opportunity. But looking back, I think I was overly focused on my career in the first, let's say half or 3 years of my experience there. And I think part of it obviously was just sort of something intrinsic in my own instincts or my own motivation. But I think there's also inevitably anywhere, not just Harvard, a lot of herd mentality on campus. And I think I kept thinking that I needed to go into these very traditional career paths that I saw many of my classmates a couple of years ahead of me, or just saw my parents talking about a lot, or just kind of people talking about through the grapevine, investment banking, consulting. And obviously there's certainly merits and benefits of going into those industries that can't be discounted or discredited. But I think a lot of times you need to think less about what society or what your parents or what your peers or what your professors or mentors expect you to do, and listen more to what you personally want to do. And so I think that's sort of something that I would tell my younger self as a piece of advice. And my younger brother is actually starting at Harvard later this year. And so that's something that I'll be telling him a bunch as well. I think sometimes you do have to make those mistakes or go down wrong paths to be able to learn it yourself. And that's probably the best way to internalize lessons. But of course, internalizing it sooner rather than later is always helpful to be able to end up going into the industries and the domains in which you can feel like you have the biggest impact and biggest fulfillment. And I think people ultimately do their best work and are their best selves when they are happy. And so I think it's really important to think about your own optimization function and not adopt the one from the market, if you will, to draw upon an economic analogy. But instead of kind of looking at what your peers have or what they're optimizing for, or what everybody else in the world and your age group is optimizing for, obviously that could be a small input if you're really lost. But I think it's really important to kind of take the time to know yourself and how you work best and where you work best and what you're curious about, and be really curiosity driven.
Interesting. Great advice, particularly for those who are taking the first steps perhaps in that particular journey. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Jessica.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So who's one of our judges. So it's been great to have you on the Judges on Fire podcast, and hopefully we'll be bumping into one another again very soon. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you.